Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the event. My name is Konstantinos Eleftheriou, and on behalf of the Hellenic Institute of Cultural Diplomacy and the manager of its Danish branch, Georgios Iliasas, I will be your host for today. With us, we have Mr. Christian Santos Okholm Rasmussen, a strategic analyst that specializes in disinformation and disinformation tactics. Mr. Santos Okholm, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Mr. Santos, would you like to share your credentials with the audience?
Yeah, so my name is Christian Santos Okholm. I'm a PhD student at the European University Institute, where I work on Russian disinformation campaigns, but also been working on a bit more broader, also on Chinese disinformation campaigns. And I'm trying to study how do their reach, how they're shaped, and counter strategies to them. So yeah, that's me.
Excellent. Now, disinformation. Although we may consider this a modern phenomenon, its roots travel way back into ancient history. During the prelude of the Peloponnesian War between the rival city-states of Athens and Sparta, the historian Thucydides wrote that the meaning of words was twisted to suit the war narrative. Audacity became friendship, moderation became cowardice, and objectivity became a sign of betrayal. Although Thucydides' work was written almost 2.5 millennia ago, its meaning still rings as true and relevant as ever before. We have reached an age of informational warfare, where the human mind is the new battlefield, and instead of arrows, spears, and swords, those who seek to conquer it use falsified information to do so. The examples that we will delve into today with the help of Mr. Santos are those of China and Russia and their attempt to win the informational warfare. It is important to note that this is strictly a scientific analysis of the methods used by the Russian and Chinese governments. The Hellenic Institute of Cultural Diplomacy is a neutral party that takes no sides in the conflict between the West, Russia, and China. With that being said, Mr. Santos, is there anything else you would like to add before we begin?
No, it's no.
All right, then I will move on to the first subject of the night. Subject number 1. Since the 2016 US elections, there have been many talks and investigations regarding online campaigns by Russia against the West. Is it true that Russia is running such campaigns? And if so, what can you tell us about them?
So whether it's true, yes, we actually have a lot of evidence on Russian subversive campaigns and disinformation campaigns. When people talk about the Robert Mueller report, there was a lot of focus on the of him investigating the collusion aspect between the Trump campaign and Russia. But that's only the last part of that report. And the first part of the report is quite extensive documentation of Russian disinformation campaigns. So what can we tell? What can we say about these campaigns? Well, first of all, as you said in the beginning, this is not a new thing. The use of information to control conflict has always been a part of conflict. As old as conflict, it's always necessary to control the story of a conflict in order to get your allies on board and also secure your own legacy. So of course this is also a thing in for Russia, and Russia has a not necessarily a tradition, but it's a tradition that goes back to its Leninist roots, where the concept of using information as a new dimension of war is rooted. And during this Soviet era, there was this idea of war as a constant. War was ever present, or conflict was ever present, and it was just a grade of how close to actual war we were, or like in the lower end, perhaps just competition. And in that was a conflict that was on multiple dimensions, among which information was a very, very important part of it. So it's all kind of always been there. And what we're seeing today is kind of, or from basically 2014 and onwards, is kind of a reemergence of that old tradition coming out. And one thing is also, it also influences the way that the Russians have perceived Western actions. So a lot of this is also being informed by what the Russians perceived the West was doing in places such as Iraq, Libya, and Kosovo, where what they saw was the West shaping a narrative before invading a country and conduct basically regime change. Now, that's a Russian reading of what happened. It's not necessarily true, but it does influence how they respond to this. So the overall goal here is to sorry, a chat popped up. So the overall goal of these campaigns is basically to subvert your enemies and create a information environment that is more suitable to you and your strategic goals. This can be by worsen political and societal cleavages within a targeted country, make them fight more amongst themselves. It can also be undermine basic social trust, so that the glue that sticks the society together is undermined, and make audiences react upon information that you have curated. And again, like this action doesn't necessarily have to be an actual action towards one specific goal. It can also just be inaction. Inaction is also an action. And so the basic idea is just to control this information environment and push certain narratives out there. And the way that the Russians do this is like they have a myriad of both online and offline channels. We can talk about radio stations, newspapers, TV, online newspapers, political magazines, but also organizations, NGOs, and such. For example, the Foreign Ministry has different cultural exchange programs, which very much look like what the West has been doing when they have cultural diplomacy. The problem is that these NGOs are also promoting revisionistic interpretations of history. For example, the Baltic, claiming that the Soviet Union was actually a very nice thing, and most Baltic people were happy about it. Or in Poland, trying to say, yeah, well, Russia or the Soviet Union at the time was not responsible for World War II when they invaded Poland. So they are pushing certain narratives there, and they're being used as tools. You also had like intelligence services who were promoting disinformation campaigns online, and then you have like private companies like the Internet Research Agency, who are also a part of this, who are also actively promoting these strategic narratives. Online, you have a very huge myriad of different actors. You have like huge media corporations who have their own like platforms where they try to promote their own narratives. You have a number of what you can call pseudo journalism, but it's basically journalists who work as propagandists. And you have, of course, the botnets and everything. So there's multiple avenues here, and it's hard to keep track of all of them, of course. But I'll try to do my best here. So what these actually do is just keep feeding similar narratives. Often it's about the West is bad, it is immoral, it has blame for everything, including the Ukraine war. Russia is almost exclusively presented as a victim of oppression and just reacting to Western oppression. And then, so yeah, sorry. So they're pushing this, and it's also like a lot of this deflecting blame we can see in Ukraine right now, where like the war crimes in Bucha and Izium, which is gradually being uncovered right now, is just being like pushed away or blamed to somewhere else. They're also very active right now with the Nord Stream 2, trying to say, oh, it's the Americans did it, and Russia has no interest in doing this. And what is very interesting to see, especially when it comes to the Russians, is how they have adopted modern social media, but also adopted to the audiences, to the target audience's own cognitive graphics or background. So let's talk about the bots and social media first. So what they do is they have They create a profile on social media, and then they make multiple of them, and they all are controlled by more or less one person. And that's basically a botnet. And what they do is they use a lot of technology to make that look very persuasive. So, for example, they have a deep fake face, which means it's auto generated. So it's a unique face, and they use that on the profile. And that's pretty effective. It's kind of a standard right now when it comes to the disinformation campaigns to use that. And the reason for using it is that when we have social media trying to combat these disinformation campaigns, they have filters trying to filter out, okay, which faces are real, have seen them before, is it a stock photo? And if it's a deep fake, it's a unique by definition. So it can't be found. So that's very very creative done. They've been active across many platforms. Facebook has been a huge platform. Twitter has been also a huge platform. But we also start to see, other platforms such as BitChute, Rutu, which is a Russian platform, and Telegram right now. So they're active on multiple platforms. And that means like if they get shut down on one, they can move over to the other. Since 2016, there has been, or also a bit before, but there's been this black market for botnets, and the Russians have been very effective in buying them, which means that it's become privatized and commercialized, these botnets, which means that they're also more and more professional. So they have behavioral patterns that, even though it's a robot and it's an algorithm that just shoots out information. So you have the very, very cheap ones that just post all the time. And then you have the more sophisticated one, which have behavioral patterns, which means like they only post when ordinary people post, which would mean, in the morning and when you're home from go home from work. So they're like a bit more sophisticated. You can also get hacked accounts, and the Russians have been very good at using these black market actors. So we found some botnets in the Balkans who were being bought by Russia. And when we look at how they then adapt to their audiences, it's very interesting to see, like, they apply different strategies, but they take some of the intrinsic or existing issues and frustrations to their target audiences, and they try to aggravate them. So this is what they did with for example, Black Lives Matter has been targeted heavy by Russian disinformation campaigns, where they basically adapted to the discourse of both Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter, and try to whip up a frenzy around racial issues. And it was kind of difficult to see which one was a Russian bot or which one was a part of the target audience of the American bots. And this is very, very clever, none of them, because the whole idea of this is to mask yourself in public discussion and deliberation. So we can't really see who are who, and then trying to ban them, and we're going to talk about that later, then we're going to hurt deliberation. But this is pretty interesting. You can also see this same thing they do with blaming or explaining that the invasion of Ukraine was basically because of bioweapons, and that there was a biolab south of Kiev, which Hunter Biden was a part of, and all of that. And that story already existed and was very, very well accepted by the QAnon community in the US, but not only in the US. So they were able to take that existing narrative and use it for their own will. You can see them how they have been using COVID conspiracies, promoting COVID conspiracies during the pandemic, the populist rhetoric, adopting anti-Muslim narratives in Eastern Europe. And also, when the invasion happened, there was a lot of stories about Ukrainian racism, which a lot of these incidents actually turned out to be true, but they just made it become more present in the information environment. They tweeted more about it. They made that a thing that we should focus on. So they're very very good at also understanding their target audience, and they're also very, very attuned to what's already being shared out there. So they can take things out of context, and they keep track with our public discourse in the West, and then they can take things out of context. So, for example, right now with the Nord Stream 2 gas explosions, or explosion on gas pipes, they've been using this video of Biden basically saying that, oh, we're going to shut down, or the Nord Stream 2 is going to be shut down. That was taken out of context and being used as an example of, well, this is clearly proof of the US always wanting to do this. But it was not in its proper context. And this is also like very effective. They've been using deep fakes, which again, like is computer uniquely created and modified with an algorithm data. Visual and audiovisual data, so a video or a photo or whatever, which have been manipulated with a deepfake technology, and they'd use that to post a video with Zelensky saying "I surrender." Problem with that thing is the Ukrainians had been told that this was a possibility of Russians sharing that kind of material, so it was completely rejected, and so it didn't have any effect, but it still shows that this can actually be used. So there's some different strategies, and they're really very well versed in this. And again, like the overall goal here is to create an information environment which is beneficial for Russia, and that means on a short term it creates maneuverability through confusion. We don't understand what's happening. We're not really reacting to it. We saw that in Crimea. We're kind of seeing it now. And then the Russia can proceed with its desired like short-term goals and try to get those before the West really reacts to it. And it's also, if the Nord Stream 2 explosions is also about trying to undermine Western unity, simply by saying, oh, this is the US who have done that, and then get the Europeans to question whether they've done it. It doesn't seem that they've been that successful on a higher political level, but there are some who are very who see reason in that. Oh yeah, it should definitely be the US who would be behind this, because why would Russia blow up their own pipeline? So it's very much a way for them to counter the West, and we're not really that attuned to it, not yet. So yeah, that's basically what my adult brain right now can say about Russia.
All right, we will keep questions for the end of the event. So shall we move to subject number 2?
Sure.
Subject number 2. As we have covered in our latest study, Bots and Pathogens, a recipe for totalitarianism, China has been trying for years to master domestic and international support through computational propaganda campaigns. Mr. Santos, what can you tell us about these efforts and the way they are conducted?
So what China has been doing is, like, often China's being looked at this when it comes to disinformation campaigns targeting outside of China as a newcomer and a very clumsy and ineffective one of that. So while the Russian like strategy is basically to fight the liberal world order, not because it has an alternative to the liberal world order, but simply because it feels strangled by the liberal world order. And by creating confusion, it can get some more flexibility and maneuverability on the short term. China has an actual alternative it wants to sell to the liberal world order. And its strategy when it comes to disinformation campaigns is to protect and promote China, the country China, and the state of China, and the CCP, like the Chinese Communist Party, as a responsible world leader. So it tries to promote that, while also pointing out that the liberal world order doesn't work and it's terrible, but this alternative is much better. So it's like it has two objectives: keeping the good name of the CCP intact, and promoting itself as a new world leader. The problem with this, in that's the difference between them and the Russian disinformation campaigns. Something is changing, but I will come back to that. Is that Russia doesn't need to sell you something. It can already takes what you're already buying. So if you're anti-establishment, it can sell you anti-establishment content. China is trying to sell you a pro-CCP concept. So the way they do this, it's very similar to Russia in its structure. So you have the CCP and the Chinese state, who have some organizations that are actually promoting propaganda. You have youth organizations who are being like called upon to do this. The thing is, most of the state capabilities in this is actually targeted more on the inside. So it's more domestic propaganda and repression of democratic debate, basically, and controlling the narrative within China. China was very early on saw that, you know, this concept or this idea of the internet is a bad one for an authoritarian regime. Russia wasn't as quick to do that, so they lagged behind when it comes to digital repression. And China is much better attuned to this. But when it comes to the external promotion, what we see is basically two organizations who are very, very aggressive in this. And the first one is United Front Work, which is, you can say, it promotes Chinese culture in a way, but is also targeting foreign states with clandestine disinformation operations. It tried, for example, to leak a piece of disinformation about the Czech and Taiwan, of Taiwan paying the Czech prime minister to come to Taiwan. So it's active, and it's also active in keeping track with the Chinese expats who live outside China. And then we have the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, with basically the armed forces of China, who have a PSYOP unit called Base, I think it's 311, who got caught running disinformation campaigns like botnets that I explained before during the Taiwanese election 2018. So they've been quite active to it, but they also have other, similar to Russia, other actors who are very, very active. And it comes with, for example, global media. Russia has Sputnik and Russia Today that have been promoting a lot of the Russia's narrative to a global audience. China has, of course, these two have been blocked, geo-blocked in response to the Ukraine invasion. They got geo-blocked in Europe. China has similar. They actually have more, and they're more well funded. So you have Xinhua News, who has an extreme social media presence and have been very aggressively buying ads on Facebook to promote China to Western audiences. You have Voice of China, which is a merger of multiple different channels of Chinese state media. And then you have Global Times, who was also very, very aggressive during COVID and promoting the story of, COVID was created by the US Army. This definitely didn't come from China. So you have large global media who are promoting very, very coordinated and tailored disinformation narratives. And this media has also been very effective in kind of parroting Russian disinformation when it comes to Ukraine. So while the Chinese state has been less clear about its preferences on Ukraine, its state media has been a lot more outspoken and blamed the West for everything. Similar to the Russian way of doing disinformation campaigns, they also they buy ads. They have training programs for third world countries, journalists in third world countries. There's been Africa, there have been journalists who got invited to China, and a lot of the response from those journalists and people who attended those meetings have been, it wasn't real journalism they were taught. They were taught very much about China, not that much else. They have something called the Stingers program. This is mainly the CGTV, which is a part of Voice of China. And Stingers is basically influencers. So they buy influencers to come and promote their narratives. And Russia has done similar things. And it's basically just to promote the good name of the CCP and China. And you've had people who have been visiting Shanxi province to show that no, the Uyghurs is not being subjected to horrible treatments. It's everything is fine. And then you've also seen a very because these media are very well funded. And they have actually been trying to aggressively buy up local media in the West, and especially in Australia and New Zealand, there's been an issue. And they try to buy up local Chinese language media. So diaspora's media in New Zealand and in Australia has been targeted by this. And they're kind of trying to control the information space. Where China really stands out compared to Russia is that they actually have working social media platforms, which are firstly controlled by the state or have a very, very intimate relation with Chinese secret services, and are actually very popular in the West. And here, like, this is TikTok. TikTok is a very, very good tool for for Chinese to conduct disinformation campaigns. Not only because you can keep track of discourse and you have a platform you can like push certain narratives, but you can algorithmically suppress specific content. So they've got caught suppressing anti-CCP content and content critical of China. Weibo, which is another platform, got caught gathering data on Chinese diaspora and kind of using this as a leverage point to silence critics. And this really also allows them to create a lot of, to gather a lot of psychographic data on Western audiences because it's very popular. A lot of people are using TikTok right now. But you have to remember that the data, whenever you use a social media platform, you're giving a lot of data points about yourself away. And if we don't trust Facebook with our data, why would we trust TikTok with our data? TikTok is subjected to Chinese law that requires them to cooperate with the intelligence services of China. So there is a backdoor, which is very, very problematic. And this gives China an edge in that an emerging social media platform, which is being more popular, they control it. Russia doesn't have the same thing. VKontakte is not as effective, which is the Russian Facebook, is not as popular in the West. And when you look at the alternatives that Russia has provided for the last 6 months after the invasion, such as Rutu, it's very bad. It's the user experience is very, very bad, and no one really wants to use it. It's not that popular. Telegram is a different story, but Telegram is still pseudo private. So there, the Chinese really have an advantage. And then we can look into, because for the last couple of years, we started to find more and more use of botnets from China. And it goes back to 2018 with some midterms in the US. I think it's 2018. Might have to check up on that, so I'm not spreading misinformation here. But we have seen that they've been targeting the US, they've been targeting Hong Kong, they've been targeting Taiwan. Now, a small difference between this, because the outlier is really the US, because in a Chinese perspective, Hong Kong is domestic politics and Taiwan is also domestic politics. Even though the rest of the world might not agree with it, they don't really necessarily see the difference. But what we've seen is that they try to target audiences outside of what China controls of the Chinese information space. So, for example, with Hong Kong, they were trying to denounce the protesters and the democracy activists in Hong Kong. They've been trying to undermine Taiwanese elections and promote people who were more easy to deal with in Taiwan, and trying to discredit the US government during elections. But the problem is, and actually for those here who are listening in from Denmark, at the beginning of the pandemic, a Danish newspaper, Jyllands-Posten, posted printed a cartoon of the Chinese flag, and that where the stars on the Chinese flag were exchanged with coronaviruses, and that was seen as very an affront to China because of what these stars actually symbolize. And then Denmark got overrun with these very, very aggressive tweets and Twitter accounts who were just spamming us. And this really kind of shows some of the issues with Chinese disinformation campaigns and their use of social media accounts. So what they do is basically what you can call bombing and spamming. So what happened in the Danish case was they were just spamming a lot of prefabricated messages to the Danes. For example, they would write, 4 hours, and they would write 4 hours all the way. The problem with that thing is, yeah, it's spamming, but no Dane understood what this was about. And then it turned out, oh no, this was actually because these Chinese disinformation actors had done some quick Google search and found out that it took Denmark 4 hours to surrender to the Germans when we got invaded back in World War II. And no Dane was aware of this. And I think most Danes would be surprised that we actually put up a fight. So this doesn't really see that they are not that attuned to the target audience that they try to. Now, this was an example which is kind of unfair to some degree because it was a very like knee-jerk reaction. So they didn't have a lot of time to prepare for this. But it's a thing that keeps popping up in the rest of the cases. So they also try to downvote criticism on Reddit, criticism of China and the CCP party, and that's just spamming and just clicking on the downvote button on Reddit, and that, yeah, it downvotes and it gives you, it shows you an understanding of how algorithms work, but not necessarily how people who are using Reddit who live outside China perceive what's being said. So they're not looking at the content, and again, it's because this content has to fit with the target audience is not really that clear. Another problem was so during the Hong Kong and Taiwanese campaigns where they were targeting the Hong Kong protest and the Taiwanese, they made some errors. First of all, when it comes to Taiwan, they didn't really write in the same letters as the Taiwanese do. The Taiwanese also speak Chinese, but the Taiwanese use traditional characters when writing on the social media. The disinformation campaign, which came from the PLA unit, used simplified characters. So that was a telltale. And they were also very bad at sharing or at using Taiwanese expressions. So they would call the president a Taiwanese leader, but not the Taiwanese president. And the same thing happened in Hong Kong, where they didn't really get the local dialect right, because the language of Hong Kong, it wasn't the same. So they were writing in ordinary Chinese, and that really again shows you it's not very well attuned to the target audiences. Now, you can also see the campaigns that were targeting the US in 2020 during the election. It didn't get a lot of attraction. So they didn't get like actual people to write and to engage with this content. It was very much like echo chambers. But what they didn't really think about is it wasn't as sophisticated. So first of all, it wasn't as sophisticated as the Russians. The Russians were much more sophisticated. But for example, they had bad bios. So when you click on a social media profile, one thing that usually tells you, okay, is this a bot or not, is if it doesn't have any biography. It had no cycle. So the botnet is just, there's some people who are sitting and working on these, working with these accounts. They would only post when during their working hours, but the working hours in China, meaning that when it was a Chinese holiday, but still a workday in the US, they would stop posting. And when they would only post in the hours of a Chinese worker, but that's because of the time difference, is also looks very off. So why would someone who claims to be a teacher from Michigan only post during the night? It doesn't make any sense. So those cycles were not really attuned to target audiences. But what they did do was they were in small clusters. So they only had accounts who would tweet and retweet each other's account. So one of the issues for the Russian disinformation campaigns during 2016 was that the Internet Research Agency, who was this clandestine private corporation who were promoting disinformation narratives during the US election 2016, they would share and promote each other's content. And that would kind of show you, okay, if you find one, you will find the others because they're usually linked to each other. They follow each other to give each other more exposure. Exactly. They're very interconnected. What the Chinese did was they split the groups up. So if you found one cluster, you wouldn't find the other clusters. And that's a very smart way to go about it, but it really requires your content to be that much more engaging. And it wasn't. So they kind of understood the technology behind it, but not necessarily, again, the promotion of these narratives, which the Russians were doing a lot better. Now, the thing is, all of these campaigns are starting to change a little bit, and we can see how the Chinese have been looking more and more towards the Russians and how they are doing it. They're starting to adapt more and more things, and trying to beef up their capabilities in this realm. So ahead of November, I think it was yesterday or a couple of days before, New York Times posted an analysis on a Chinese disinformation campaign, a small one on Facebook that was targeting the US election in November, the midterms in November. And there you could see that they would actually go in and take certain points, standing points, and narratives already existing in US discourse and try to use that a little bit. They auto-translate it. They also did this in 2018, but they auto-translate it so you can kind of still see it's not genuine content. But the thing that they are actually trying to adapt to the narrative that already exists is actually shows a signal that, okay, they're actually trying to change. We've also seen that, you know, the PLA's unit, PSYOP unit based 311, applied for some for some funding and apply for some collaborations together with the National University of Defense on deep learning. And that's kind of interesting to see that this unit, which specializes in psychological warfare or information warfare, start to work with someone with the university on deep learning. This Christmas, there was a leak. There were some leaks from the Shanghai Police Department. It was basically a call for disinformation campaigns where they posted up and said, we want disinformation capabilities. We want you to have this many accounts. We want this larger reach. So you can start seeing, okay, they're trying to get private actors in on this. And there were performance indicators which clearly showed that they were interested in different levels of sophistication. So there's a lot of things happening right now, and they're really trying to like branch out and think more creatively about this. You can also see this during like the COVID, that although it was also a defense of China and the CCP, they were also starting to attack people. They were starting to blame the US for the pandemic, and say like, oh, it's the US who created this to undermine China. And with this one that the New York Times revealed a couple of days ago, we also saw there was more anti-Biden content and not only pro-CCP content. So there's something changing. All of these campaigns that I've mentioned here were very bad at actually getting people to believe it. So it didn't really get high engagement, which the Russians were very, very effective to do. There's one anecdote which is often used when it comes to how effective the Russians actually were, was during the 2016 election, they managed to get people to go to a demonstration in Houston, Texas, without ever, they organized it on Facebook, and people showed up with guns in front of a mosque, and they were waiting for the organizers who never showed up because the organizers were in St. Petersburg. But that's really effective to get people to actually go out. There's nothing remotely close to this when it comes to the Chinese. It's not very well done, like craftsmanship, when it comes to creating the narratives, but it's very good use of the technology behind it. So you can say, like, even though China is a newcomer to this, they're definitely catching up on the Russians. So yeah.
All right, we already have some questions from the audience, but as we said, we will leave it for the end of the event. Shall we move to subject number 3?
By all means.
Subject number 3. Censorship and the banning of online material has been an extremely divisive issue in the Western world. Nowadays, it seems like we live in a binary world where something is either wholly true or utterly false. One example of this is the man-made COVID theory, which was first labeled as disinformation, only to be slowly vindicated as a plausible scenario. Expanding on this example, what are the issues of censorship when approaching information in such a binary manner, Mr. Santos?
So one of the issues with this was like, so if we go in and we say, okay, the world is either truth or false, then we kind of fix it. We kind of fix it, and we can't really move out of this. So once we've said one statement is true, it has to be true, right? And this is what disinformation actors are using, because that's not the case. Truth operates on a continuum. There's more knowledge. There's something we know that we are more certain of than something else, and there's something that we have a hunch about, and so on and so forth. And what the disinformation actors is, like, they operate within that continuum. So they come up with claims, and you say, but this is a lie. Oh, no, it's just my interpretation of things. You can have, like, there's a discussion. Okay, when did you incite to something? Do you just by posting a picture, is that incitement, or do you actually have to say people go out and do something bad? There's also, when do you present something as fact? When is it opinion? Satire? Was this just a joke? Sarcasm is very difficult to understand, to label as either right or wrong just by looking at it from a tweet. So they operate on this, and thinking in binary terms makes you vulnerable. So first of all, with building on the COVID example, when the COVID started, we had almost no knowledge of this disease. So a lot of what we did back then was like gradual building knowledge and making decisions on the best available information we had. A lot of information would turn out to be false, or like simply we didn't know better at the time. So we had to build our knowledge about this disease as we went on. And that kind of says, like, truth, yeah, sure, it's relative to the knowledge that we have. And this is not to vindicate, to say, oh, everything can be true, and try to say, oh, I can choose my own facts. You can't. But you have to show that you actually have some evidence for what you're saying, or come up with some rationale behind it. But you still have to be open that there can be some new information out there that might change your fact and change your analysis, right? But if we commit to like this binary thinking, then once we said, okay, this is true, then we kind of have to stick with it. And that's really problematic, because once we see that, this is obviously false, we're left in a dilemma of either we can backtrack and say, oh, be very honest and say, this was our mistake, and we're going to go back, or we can keep up our definition of truth. Both of them are pretty bad. Backtracking is definitely to be preferred, because what happens is, like, you're undermining your credibility and the trust that we can put in you. Because first of all, you made a mistake. Second of all, now you're just not really upfront about you making a mistake. And there's some literature in this, in how companies survive bad press and being ahead of the curve, and being out and taking responsibility for your bad actions. Like, this is problematic if you just reject it because you already rejected it further. Then it's no longer about truth. It's just about you being stubborn. Another problem with this is that once you start banning, you give indirect legitimacy to the thing that you've banned, especially among what you can call conspiratorial or fringe communities, who are people who already buy into conspiracy theories, who already buy in on anti-establishment narratives, and buy in on this, that there is somewhere out there's a powerful elite that doesn't want you to know the truth, the actual truth. So once you ban it, they will say, of course you banned it. So because you don't like it, hence it must be the truth. So if it's banned, it's probably true. It can also just be like, if you ban just by banning it, you create so much commotion that people become more aware of it. This is called the Barbra Streisand effect, which is basically, in trying to suppress something, you give it more attention and it explodes. And so there's definitely some backlashes to it. And there's also this idea that we can ban something in a digital world. We live in a digital age. There's a lot of access to information, and information will keep having find a new avenue. So what we saw, for example, with some of the bannings in the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, was that the EU banned Russia Today and Sputnik, so you couldn't access it. But suddenly something else, like other platforms, popped up and said, oh, I have some information here too. Telegram became a huge platform for information because you could access that. And once you when you look into these communities that are sharing a lot of misinformation, and also those who are sharing disinformation, usually they will start creating, backup channels. Once they become established, they will say, okay, this is the group that we're going to use, but once, when we get busted, we're going to move over here. And then they kind of have a backup group, Facebook group. And now they're also starting to have backup groups on alternative platforms. Again, BitChute, Parler, Gab, a lot of platforms whose main claim to fame and their reason to exist is freedom of speech. These platforms kind of came as a reaction to more and more censorship on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. And they're very, very adamant in their beliefs. So we're not going to be able to communicate with them as we've been able to communicate with Facebook or with Google, to say, you have to take this extremist content down because it's hurting people. They won't do that. It's part of their DNA. They're far out of reach. We're pushing people out on those platforms. So it becomes a backlash. The thing we have to remember here is that the attempts of censoring information during COVID, and also because COVID was such a crisis, and out of COVID, there grew a ecosystem of misinformation outlets. And there was with that also came an existing infrastructure that new misinformation can draw on. One example here is the sovereign citizen movement, with the people in, so there's some protest in Canada where they parked their trucks in the middle of, I think it was Ontario. I'm very sorry, it's a bit late. That protest started spreading much quicker than we had expected. And one of the reasons why is because those people who were part of that protest was also part of the anti-vax movement. That anti-vax movement was global. So what happened? We saw a similar protest happening in France and in Germany, in the US, although the US didn't work that well, but still. So we created some highways in the information space that we no longer have any control over. So it created a backlash. Of course, censoring, and there's some research that has been done in this, shows that there's going to be a temporary fragmentation, and people are probably going to give up on listening to some of this misinformation because it's too cumbersome to find new avenues. You have to get a VPN, or you have to understand how a VPN works and all of this. So there's some additional cost for you accessing that information. But we're also, and this is not scientifically proven yet, but my best bet would be that we're also going to see a consolidation at one point, because at one point, all of these communities are going to find one platform that they're going to converge towards and communicate with. And we can see this, again, look at Telegram during the Russian invasion. Suddenly, some platforms who only had perhaps 30,000 followers ended up having 800,000 followers, or almost 1 million followers. And that's because people I still have questions. I want some answers, and I'm not satisfied with what the mainstream media gives me. And the mainstream media, I don't trust them. And that's one of the core issues, that we're treating symptoms rather than actually treating the root of the problem. But what those people then do is they go over to some other platforms that they're going to be more happy with those answers. So we're going to see a consolidation at one point. But there's not a lot of study being done on this and how this actually works, the dynamics behind this online. The few that are only focusing on a very, very short time period. So we're going out on a speculative. The last thing I want to say is there has been this argument of freedom of speech does not involve freedom of reach, meaning that your freedom of speech isn't harmed by you not having a social media account. And I think that is a bit tricky claim to make, because I think censoring people in totalitarian states and autocracies such as Russia and China would probably very much like that argument, because, well, you can still have your freedom of speech, you're just in a cell right now to say it. And it's problematic. And that argument is being made and being used in these fringe communities to say like censorship is a violation of freedom of speech. And I don't think necessarily you can get around that. You don't need freedom of reach, freedom of speech, because why would you else have freedom of speech if you can't communicate with people, if you can't talk to people? And this is the whole idea of freedom of the press, right? Is to actually reach and talk to people and have a dialogue about this. So the censorship tool has a lot of implications with it that could be more worse than just removing it for a while, because it's going to come back, and it is going on some compromises on liberal democracy, and especially when you have so many other tools out there that can already be used. Fact checkers being more promoting your own narrative based on facts and based on transparency, that makes it easier for people to access the right information. And also, a lot of these are symptoms of bigger societal problems. The people who are more responsive to disinformation are people who don't trust the government, don't trust authorities, don't trust media, don't trust elites, and that trust has to be rebuilt before you can find have actual solutions to it. So it's like we have to be very, very careful, because what we're doing is just pushing people away when we say what you're saying is false and you shouldn't be allowed to say that.
Is there anything else you would like to add, Mr. Santos?
No, that was my few cents.
All right, I already have two questions that came to us via Facebook. I will start with the first one. I'm also posting it on the chat so you can see it as well. It reads as follows. Thanks for sharing your insights on the topic. We have heard disinformation strategies being deployed by big state actors. To what extent are similar strategies being used by other actors of the international system? So, as I understand it, the person asking the question is asking, are big corporations or NGOs or world organizations using these tactics? Is what I'm getting from this question.
Yes, they are. So one thing with so the Russians' use of black market actors, when the Russian state isn't buying troll farms in the Balkans or in Nigeria, those actors have to find income somewhere else. So you can see in South America, there's been a few instances where political parties have used botnets to promote them in local elections. So there you have one example. You have seen companies who are trying to promote specific. Again, my focus is on Russia, and when I have time, China. So this is a bit outside my field, but what I know is there have been instances of them using this, and it makes a lot of sense. And when it comes to the black market actors, is they have to keep relevance. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to guarantee as much exposure to the content that they want to promote. So how do you promote content on social media is that you keep engagement up. One good telltale of a botnet is that they jump from one type of content to another. So, for example, before Russia invaded Ukraine, and in the weeks up to they invaded Ukraine, you can see that there were some large clusters of social media accounts who would go from promoting, let's say, pornography, and then suddenly becoming an expert on Eastern Ukrainian military doctrine. Like that doesn't make any sense. But that showed that they were trying to keep their engagement up because people click on naked photos. So that's a tool of them to stay relevant. And you can see the jumps, and some of them also promote, ordinary stuff, and simply just to get the attraction. So yeah, also NGOs, organizations, private companies are using this as well. So yeah.
All right, I believe this covers that. Our second question, and I'm posting it in the chat, reads as follows. What would you advise online users so that they do not fall victims of disinformation campaigns? I believe this is a very straightforward question.
Yeah. First of all, you have to be, like I usually say, check yourself, check your own feelings, because if you have something that you're very, very emotional about, when you hear some information that fits that emotion, it doesn't make it true. So, for example, right now there's been there was some after the Russian state declared mobilization. There was a lot of videos of Russian men fleeing from conscription. And there was one photo of I think it was a 35-kilometer long queue of cars outside the Finnish border. And there was this photo, you can see like the green grass and the cars and green trees behind it. Problem with that story was it wasn't true. And it's quite easy to tell it wasn't true because the grass in Finland right now is brown. And it's autumn in Finland, it's not summer. So there was an issue that was misinformation that got spread. And it had something to do with right now there was a euphoria of and to some degree a Schadenfreude that the Russian men were fleeing the country. Like we've all seen pictures from the Georgian border, and that makes sense. And then of course we should also see it in Finland, but we just let our feelings get ahead of ourselves. So we have to check, okay, is this actually true? Just because there's a video doesn't make it true. So you have to be aware of how our feelings can be exploited by people. Right now, with, for example, the Nord Stream 2 incidents, we don't have a lot of knowledge about what happened. So there's an excess of demand for more information. And again, creates an ideal opportunity for disinformation actors to just spread out stories. So we have to be very careful. And when those situations occur, we have to be aware that there are some actors out there who are not interested in you being more informed, getting closer to what actually happened. They are interested in you buying into a narrative. So again, there was a lot of actors who were promoting, oh, this is the US who have done it. The US is behind it. The US had, there was I think it's a ship and a helicopter who flew over the area. Hence, that must be the reason. That doesn't prove anything. It's just another piece of a larger puzzle. And you have to be aware that there's no silver bullet in these things. There's something that's going to take time. And we have to slowly gather information about this. So quick shooting from the hip is not a good thing. So you have to be aware that you have something that is, makes you vulnerable, but you also have to be aware if there's someone out there who are willing to deceive you. One thing that sometimes people ask me, what kind of sources do you go to when you want to look at this and this and that? There's no single source who will tell you the truth all the time. Mainly because they don't know everything. It's not because they don't want to, but it's because they don't have the time to check up on everything. So you can't find one place that will always give you all the truth. So you have to have multiple sources, and you have to see how many of these sources are actually confirming the same thing. Are they corroborating? How much are basically good old critical thinking and being skeptical to sources. So yeah.
Or as Christian Ryan of The Last American Vagabond would say, do your own research, do your due diligence, reach your own conclusions.
Yeah.
Don't take anything for granted.
Yes, but also be very aware of what you know and what you don't know, because there are experts out there who know a lot more about this. And I think one of the problems of saying, you have to do your own research is to ask people to become experts in this topic that they are currently interested in. And that's just if you have an ordinary job, you have to pick up the kids, and you don't have the time to really go deep into these things. So you have to find some experts who have that knowledge, because they can actually help you navigate in all of this. But you have to be aware that those experts they won't be 100% right all the time. They will make some mistakes, and their analysis might be skewed a little bit. But if you have more experts on a specific knowledge who are saying this is probably where we're going at, then you can be more and more safe in this. So do your own research, sure, but also be aware of your own limitations.
Well, I don't see any more questions. There's a last question that comes from me. We've talked a lot about troll farms at the past hour. For those watching this who are not very familiar with what a troll farm is, could you explain to them what it is, how it operates, just in layman's terms, a very simple explanation so they can get a general idea?
Okay, so I think if we talk about this in terms of a troll farm and a bot and a botnet. So a troll farm is a collection of individuals, of human beings who sit in front of a computer and they are just writing. They're being told what to write, and they all like post the same thing. And they are usually used, to engage in public discourse and try to either destroy the public discourse, but just irritating people, or also promoting certain narratives, saying, "Oh, this one is actually fits in this talking point right here." And they're human commentators with an agenda. But botnets are basically a software program. So here you have one guy. Sometimes we call them bot herders, who control multiple social media platforms, social media profiles, through an algorithm. And it's basically saying, for example, whenever I post this, I want all of these 50 accounts to retweet it or to post the same thing at the same time. So they're using to amplify exposure of that specific content. The gap between the two have narrowed more and more over the years because technology has become more and more sophisticated. Again, having cycles of behavioral patterns. So make sure that that your bots post as a regular human being. That makes it easier and more relatable. And having some algorithms who actually are able to communicate with people and like have some kind of AI. There's been some research done on this. So the gap is narrowing. And some like I've heard the term cyborg to be used with this, whether it's a mixture with sometimes it's a human being, sometimes it's just the algorithm talking. So it's like a continuum. But the main idea here is to amplify a specific talking point, either by humans doing it because they have more social skills, right? Or having a very crude algorithm just pushing the same narrative over and over again and same content. I hope that made sense.
I believe even those unfamiliar with those terms and the whole subject now have more of a solid grasp on it. I don't see any more questions on our comments here on StreamYard or on Facebook. So I believe we have reached the end of our talk. Mr. Santos, thank you very much for being with us tonight. We appreciate your expertise on the matter.
Thank you so much. Happy to get out of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here as well. Your support means a lot to us. And on behalf of the Hellenic Institute of Cultural Diplomacy, I bid you good night.